What was it I said in the break room review of Defied Bloods?
If Delroy Lindo does not get an Oscar nomination for his work in this, then we need to just burn the Academy Awards to the ground, because holy crap.
All right. Shall we? Maybe not. The Academy Award nominations are out. This was something I didn't think I'd have anything to say about, because most of the things that were being tipped for a heck of a lot of nominations I hadn't seen. Only thing that I actually have seen is Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. Review up in the break room if you care about that. But looking over the reviews, or actually more specifically looking at the headline that the film with the most nominations was Mank, kind of got me thinking. Because Mank was a movie that when the trailer came out, I was a little bit interested in. And then the reviews started coming out and it sounded good. And then for my own curiosity, because I've gotten a little bit more cautious about historically set films, particularly ones that appear to have some kind of political element in them, I looked into how accurate was it. And I knew it wasn't going to be 100% accurate. These things never are. They can't be, and that's just the way it is. But the nature of the changes honestly kind of made me go, I'm sorry, what? I kind of lost interest. Now, in the interest of not having people tell me that I'm a jackass for not watching the movie before talking about it, and then using it as a leaping off point to talk about this whole sort of thing that I'm going to be getting into today, I did go and watch Mank. And as a film, strictly speaking as a film, it's pretty good. Acting's good. It does a really good job of evoking visually the time period that it comes from. It cherry picks and mimics certain elements of Citizen Kane, which it's about the writing of the script for Citizen Kane, so that's totally fitting. It's a very well done movie. So I get why it was nominated, especially given that it's a little bit of a Hollywood self-back-patting session. In some ways, it's self-critical in specific areas, but kind of selectively, which is part of what I'm going to be getting into a little bit on that. Before I launch too far into this, let me explain where I'm going, and then I'll back up and we'll talk about Mank, and I'll talk about some of the other films that I feel like are marks of this same kind of thing. What I'm going to be talking about here is historical revisionism, and more specifically, politically minded historical revisionism. In terms, and I don't just mean like you're revising it to put forward your own politics. I'm actually going to be touching incredibly lightly on possible motives for the reasons these things happen, because I can't know the minds of the people who make these decisions. Screenwriters, producers, directors, I can't read their minds. And unless they've spoken on the record of exactly why they did something, it's really not my place to project. I will discuss those possibilities a little bit down the line. But when I say politically minded, I mean alterations of the political beliefs of the people being depicted, or in some cases pretending that those things didn't exist and minimizing them. So let me first, as quickly as I can, because this is not meant to be specifically about Mank, but let me show my work on this a little bit. I've linked to an article from Slate, which did, at least from what I found, the best compiling of the major differences. So long story as short as I'm prepared to make it, Herman Mankiewicz was a screenwriter. He was contracted to a variety of studios over the years in Hollywood. He was renowned for his wit, being a drunk, and being a very prolific gambler. He wrote the original script for Orson Welles. That then got made into what is widely considered to be one of the greatest films ever made. There is some dispute in the years since exactly how much of it he wrote versus how much of it Orson Welles wrote. They both got an Academy Award for the screenplay. It was the only Academy Award that Kane got. And this is ostensibly about the writing of the movie, but it's kind of not, because it weaves a very strange political angle to things. Now, that's not to say that Herman Mankiewicz was a completely apolitical person. We actually know a little bit about some of his personal politics, at least. And some of those even get acknowledged in the films, but even the framing of that seems a little suspect to me. So, spoilers for Mank. Where it ends up ultimately going is this idea that Mankiewicz got wrapped up in and was ultimately personally moved and motivated by the failed gubernatorial candidacy of Upton Sinclair, who was a writer and a social activist, socialist, who was running for governor of California. He actually secured the Democratic Party nomination. And because he was considered very socially radical by the measures of the time, actually probably still by a fair number of measures even today, he spurred on basically all of the big money in Hollywood to amass against him and try and figure out how to stop him. Now, that much is all absolutely true. And what is shown in Mank is that Upton Sinclair was largely impacted by these political advertisements that were dressed up like newsreel interviews about that basically tried to make it look like these are the kind of people voting for Upton Sinclair. These are the kind of people who are voting against him. What does that say to you? Very much playing to anxieties about class and financial security and race. And those were fairly effective. And in the film, the idea for those was hit upon by a gentleman by the name of Irving Thalberg, who was an acquaintance of Mankiewicz, based off an offhanded comment that Mankiewicz made. So in a way, Mankiewicz feels a little bit responsible. Mankiewicz was also friends with Shelley Metcalf, who directed those ad pieces. And Metcalf had a massive crisis of conscience. After the election, it was clear that those really helped secure Sinclair's loss. And Metcalf took his life out of a combination of shame and also having recently gotten a Parkinson's diagnosis and being scared to death of what that would mean. And this then spurred Mankiewicz to really hold a grudge against the forces that amassed against Upton Sinclair, and he felt cost his friend his life. The parts of that are true, the ads did exist. Irving Thalberg did orchestrate that. He was an acquaintance of Mankiewicz. Shelley Metcalf did not exist. There was a director for those things, a guy by the name of Felix Feist, who died decades later and did not appear to have any kind of issues of conscience around having made those things at all. And there is absolutely nothing to back up the idea that Mank was in support of Upton Sinclair, was moved by Upton Sinclair, and wrote Cain as revenge against William Randolph Hearst, who was, the big newspaper magnate who was the big money behind most of this move to help ensure that Sinclair didn't get into office. Now, those aren't the only liberties the film takes. When it comes to the question of who really wrote Citizen Kane, it picks a version that makes Mankiewicz look as much like the sole author as humanly possible, whereas most research into the matter makes it look like he may have written the first draft himself, but Wells did do significant contributions between then and when it actually went to film, so those should not be discounted. And the truth is most likely agreed to be somewhere in the middle. But the film, favors Mank's version of events, which it's meant to be about him. That's honestly fair enough. But it was that whole angle, this whole instilling of a brand new, there's no evidence to support at all, theory of political motivation behind the writing of the greatest film ever made. And in addition, that's not the only political tweaking. Mankiewicz has a conversation with his brother Joseph, who is a real person, and basically about what was at the time the newly forming Writers Guild of America, which is the writers' union in Hollywood. And Mank didn't have any interest in joining. He didn't think it was a good idea. He was pretty outspoken against unions. Now, in the film, this is a private conversation between him and his brother where he's expressing like, this is just not a good idea. And those sentiments are very much something that Mankiewicz had in real life, except in real life, he didn't have them in private conversations. He took out a full-page ad in Variety saying, join the Writers Guild of America, all you have to lose is your brains. So to take something that was an outspoken public position and turn it into a private conversation immediately downplays how strongly he held these beliefs. And then putting that early and having him appear to be inspired by Upton Sinclair later implied a backing off of those beliefs, which again, there's nothing in evidence of. Now, I want to move off of Mank as a specific thing because I feel like there's an odd trend in terms of either shifting or minimizing the politics of people in biographical and or historically set pictures. Some other examples from recent years. You have something like The Greatest Showman, which basically took the most generous interpretation of views that at various points in his life, P.T. Barnum did express, assumed they were all true at face value, and assumed that he held those beliefs all through his life, as opposed to maybe this was something he came to much later than the point when he was basically running a human zoo. There's The Iron Lady, the Meryl Streep film, which, despite being about Margaret Thatcher, one of the most influential conservative figures in world history from the last 40 years, and did a biographical pick about her that avoided her actual political stances, actions, and beliefs as much as humanly possible. I'm sorry, what? And part of what's frustrating for me about this is that as I mentioned, the reviews that came out about Mank were great, but I only saw passing mention of historical inaccuracies in a couple of them, usually only fixating on the fact that it kind of demonizes Wells and favors Mank in the authorship question. But nearly everything completely omitted all the other stuff. Now, I don't know if this was because the reviewers in question didn't know what the real history was. It's not actually particularly well-known history, and unless they did additional research, they may not have known the things about Sinclair or the fact that Shelley Metcalf was made up, etc. So that's a possibility. Or they feel that it doesn't detract from the experience of watching it as a film. But it's just strange to me that it's so well reviewed, so well regarded, yet can have such a clear and drastic shift and or insertion of political positions into it, but not enough to warrant even a mention on the Wikipedia page. And the Wikipedia page saw fit to mention every single music track and how long they are, but wouldn't even give a passing mention to the historical elements of this. It's very strange to me, and it seems to be this notion or this trend from filmmakers, writers, producers, what have you, of altering or minimizing the political stances of the people they choose to depict. Now, at its most extreme and comical, you get something like The Patriot. The Mel Brooks movie from 2000, which I actually rather like. I think it's a good movie, but it is laughable. The fact that this takes place during the American Revolution and Mel Brooks' character owns a farm and a plant. I'm not sure. Plantation might be the wrong word because I cannot remember well enough, but he has black people work in the fields. But the film chose to firmly establish, oh, these aren't slaves. These are freed people who he employs. The reality is that people with that kind of money and power in that point of time had slaves. They just did. We know they did. It's not necessarily a comfortable fact, but pretending that, oh, no. Mel Gibson isn't playing an actual historical figure on that, so it's more a matter of historical setting rather than trying to make a specific actual real-life person look better. But it was so bizarre and frankly just laughable. It became a joke. Like, why would you do that? Now, I said I wouldn't dwell too much on motives because I can't know. motives. But I can surmise a couple of possibilities. And then, regardless of what the actual inclinations are for why this happens, there's still a problem, and I'll get to that. The first possibility is that the people who are making these decisions, which again, it's multitudinous how many people would be involved in these kind of decisions, from screenwriters to directors, probably producers, and possibly even actors if they are a big enough name, or they're the kind of person who gets an executive producer credit just for being in a movie. All these people are going to have some degree of influence, but at some level, part of it might be a desire to make a character more palpable to the movie-going audience. So the idea of doing it for the audience's sake is you want the audience to be on the side of your protagonist. And there's an inclination to not give them an element to their personality that would be considered irredeemable by modern-day standards. And especially if you're going to do a historical drama of anyone who had any degree of influence, you are going to run into people who were racist, sexist, misogynist, anti-Semitic. So your options become, well, let's just not talk about that. Or in more extreme cases, a bit like Mank, let's project a different set of beliefs, or beliefs that we can't actually back up that this person actually held. And there's always the possibility that there is, a political agenda to try and alter the public's perception of someone. And I'm not going to discount that and say it's impossible, but that's the kind of conspiratorial narrative I really go out of my way to try to avoid. I don't want to spew it. I don't want to have it in my comments. I don't want to go there. Unless you've got evidence to back it up, just please don't. I wonder if part of it comes from an instinct that we like to believe that we only relate to and connect with good people, or people who hold the values that we consider to be good. And it can be difficult if you have created something a bit more like a hero narrative in your head, coming to terms with how this person doesn't meet you where you're at in terms of your own beliefs and values can be difficult. I mean, I've had to make my own call on that with figures like J.K. Rowling, which obviously that's a different conversation because Mankiewicz has been dead for a very long time. So it's not quite the same thing of dealing with someone who's still alive and you have to cope with it then. But I think there is an instinct to be like, well, I want to give this person a motivation that would be the kind of motivation that I would have had or that I could have admired. Because we don't really know why Mankiewicz wrote a script that very clearly skewered William Randolph Hearst. We don't actually know how much of that was his own idea and how much of that was spurred on by Orson Welles, who, while it is very likely that Mankiewicz wrote the complete original first draft more or less on his own, Welles was in contact with him prior to that, knocking back and forth story concepts. So even if we take it for granted that it was Mankiewicz's decision to target Hearst and have him be the basis for Charles Foster Kane, the man as a personality, so best as history remembers him, just liked needling people. He was a little bit of an intellectual troll, which is something the film actually does kind of capture, but it still felt the need to give him a motivation, a grudge for some reason. This sort of thing troubles me in general because it feels like a microcosm for this country and this culture's inability to grapple with its own faults in modern day and in history. We don't like being reminded that the founding fathers were slave owners. Or if someone's going to remind it, we want to brush that off and instead focus on everything else they did. Because we can't seem to help but sort the world into the good people and the bad people. And when we've decided someone is a good person, is one of the good people. We don't want to believe the things that in a vacuum we would go, well, that's a bad thing that bad people do. I had a comment, actually earlier today at time of filming, on my video that I did about Joss Whedon. I'm not going to put it up because I don't want to do a direct call out on them, but they said things like, he's a good person, he deserves a shot at redemption, and all these other things. And very clearly, this commenter wasn't able to grapple with the idea that something that they liked was made by anyone other than a good person. And I know some people feel like either they feel themselves or they feel like society is telling them, if you think someone is a bad person, you are not allowed to enjoy their art. And look, I say that as someone who has very strongly distanced myself from the works of J.K. Rowling at this point, as well as Kevin Spacey. Kevin Spacey was in some of my favorite movies of all time, none of which I've rewatched. But it's not out of spite, it's because I'm not comfortable with it. But I'm not suddenly going to turn around and do what some people tend to do. And again, you've seen this with J.K. Rowling if you pay attention to the conversation. One of the defense mechanisms that people go to, even former fans, well, the books weren't actually all that good in the first place. Basically removing the value of the books so that it's okay to file the entire thing under, well, bad people. But if the book has value and the writer is a freaking nightmare, trying to meld all that together and work both those thoughts through in your head, that's work. And people don't want to do the work. It's like when I talked about how you can't separate the artist from the art, why that phrase frustrates me. Because people use it as an excuse to not do the work of reconciling these things. And I think as a nation, as a culture, this is a sickness. We won't find a way to acknowledge that people we admire, or people who did one or two things we admire or stood for something that we admire, had other big problems with them. We minimize those, we ignore them, or we rewrite them. And is it any wonder that we live in a nation that can't seem to reconcile its own history and acknowledge the bad things that we as a country have done? Because we're a good country who does good things. And acknowledging the bad things feels like you're saying the country's bad. And in fact, there are people out there who make that argument. That if you say something is bad about this, you are condemning everything. People say that about artistic works. That if I say J.K. Rowling is a TERF and a transphobe, that I'm saying her work has no value. I'm not saying that. Or that if I'm saying her work has value, that I have to not complain about her. I absolutely do have to complain about her. But whether it is something as extreme as the Patriot and pretending like somebody adjacent to the Founding Fathers wouldn't have had slaves, or something as selective as The Greatest Showman, and look, there are things that mitigate this. The Greatest Showman, for example, being a big overblown musical, one can make the argument, well, who's going to take it as a historical document? They're busting out into song, for crying out loud. Okay, there's an argument to be made there. But a lot of people, for a lot of these figures, come to know them first, if not exclusively, through film. And I'm not saying that we have to dirty up these figures. Like when I talk about tropes, like when I talk about trends, it's not each individual instance that bothers me. I could have written Mank off and these issues of historical revisionism if I didn't take a step back and look at the tendencies of Hollywood to do this in general. And some might even say, well, Hollywood in a movie like Mank is self-critical as well. I mean, look at how it portrays Louis B. Mayer, who is a studio head and not a good person. And it's absolutely condemning him. Yeah, but it's condemning him because he was associated with Hearst. And Hearst has become one of the acceptable villains of history. So, yeah, it's okay to condemn him. He's already dirtied by association. Mank isn't. So let's make him more heroic. Let's say flat out that he was the only person at the studio who tried to fight back and refused to contribute to a political campaign when Louis B. Mayer said everybody had to do it. When in fact there were a collection of people at the studio who refused to do it, and Mank was not one of them. People can be admirable. They can be fascinating. They can be intriguing. They can be worth talking about without being overly heroic. I think about the review I did for The Straight Story, which might become my new benchmark for a true story or biographical film. Because what was great about that film is the fact that it is so accurate, both logistically but also emotionally. The tone. It doesn't amp things up. That's a movie about a guy who rides several hundred miles on a riding mower to go and see his brother. And it could have upped a ton of stuff, could have added a ton more complications about things that happened to him on the road, or a bunch of more things, overblown, the motivations for certain things that happened. It didn't do any of that. Because the story was still worth telling as it actually happened. You don't have to make the story more exaggerated. You don't have to make the character more noble. Complicated people are worth telling stories about. And we seem to be okay with that in fiction way more than we are in biopics. And that just troubles me as a pattern, as a trend. And again, specific instances, some you can justify better than others, or some you can brush off more than others. But to see something like Mank get this many nominations, this much praise, this high Rotten Tomatoes score, I actually did check. First time I've been on that site in a year. But despite all that, so little, virtually no conversation about this nonsensical conspiratorial motivation for what he did and this complete fabrication of his involvement in politics that there's no evidence he was involved with, and what we know doesn't exactly line up with those political views. The casualness, I think, is what bothers me. The casualness and the failure for these things to get noted, the failure for them to get explained. But in interviews, David Fincher would be asked about the authorship issue, but not the rest of it. Not that I could find. But again, that I have some frustration about not knowing the motivations, but even without motivations, how casually this is happening, how frequently, and how little it's called out. It just irks me. This was not a scripted video. If I'd had more time, I would have sat down and really structured my thoughts a bit more cleanly on this whole thing. But I got to be completely honest. I am behind the eight ball on a fair number of things right now. And I've also got my birthday coming up this weekend. And I really just wanted a clean plate. I wanted to be sure everything was done. So I was not prepared to have this eat up more time, despite how long I ended up rambling. I hope folks will refrain from saying, well, it's the woke agenda. Because again, we don't know motivations. And it's a completely different motivation if they are changing things because of a presumed favoritism from the audience or doing things because of their own values. And unless you can prove and provide evidence of some kind that one or the other is the case, then that's not an argument that is going to benefit anybody. But I will still be happy to hear your thoughts. You leave them down in the comments. I have a Patreon. That's how I make my living. Mentioned it's my birthday. That'd be a nice present. I also have a Amazon and Etsy wish list. I mean, if you want to go for that. But you don't have to do any of that. Liking, sharing, subscribing helps me out too, but don't worry about that either. Because at the end of the day, you are the council. I'm only running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.